Hey, this is Boaz. Thanks for showing up. Please visit the Fools and Sages podcast at foolsandsagespodcast.com. There are no spaces and it's all spelled out. You can find show notes, references, bios, merch, and other cool features. Contact us if you have feedback or a question, if you want to appear on the show, or if you want either or both of us to be a guest on your podcast. You can listen and subscribe on Spotify, YouTube, Rumble, Apple Podcasts, iHeart Podcasts, and anywhere else great podcasts are found. And follow us on X and Instagram. Support us on Patreon. The Patreon link's also in our website. And thank you. Enjoy the show. Good afternoon, Brian.
How are we doing?
I'm good. I'm still on the mend a little bit. Energy level is essentially back, but I still have this sinus stuff going on. So apologies if I sound stuffy.
No problem.
You're staying warm enough?
Yeah, and the sun is out and it's a little later today, so I didn't even start a fire. I'm a little hunkered, but
Yeah. So one thing that's come up a number of times in our conversations that I thought might be fun to go into a little more is the topic of martial arts. And I think there are a few threads on that are worth pulling on. One is your relationship to it and kind of the role that it's played and is playing in your life.
Mhm.
But context for that could also be why martial arts, right? Because when we have conversations about philosophy and where we think philosophy is going, we say things like craftsmanship and martial arts and shamanism and these other schools outside of philosophy are useful for informing your understanding and in other ways my understanding of how to be in the world.
Right.
So I've practiced with you some, I've practiced with Blaze some, but I have nothing like the depth of experience that you do, and maybe you can connect those up for us.
Yeah. Sure. Well, it's interesting. In our last episode, we gave a kind of a run-up of Western thought and brought it up to the current chapter. And this martial arts, and particularly martial arts in the West, are an interesting element relevant to this current chapter of global philosophy, let's say. And the I was just reading in the beginning here a book by John Dewey. So it's written. It just became public domain this year, so it's 95 years later after publishing, and he talks about this break, and he goes into a great explanation of it that happens between the practical and the pure. The we've spoken about this with this in the episode about the semantic world. In Plato's conception, the circle is pure and timeless and unchanging, and circular things are corrupted. And so that sort of a prejudice translates its way all the way to, 100 years ago for John Dewey to complain about it. And what he says is that the changeable stuff, the matter gets looked down upon because it's corrupted. It's not pure. It's contaminated by non-being. And that's that being with a capital B that's timeless. So it's corruptible. And so we look down on it. And we in the West, you might say that we have a prejudice towards the mind away from the body.
Maybe as a byproduct of rationalism.
That's a good way, a possibility. I heard one excuse or one accounting of it is they said that, when you look at the sages in iconography of sages in the East, you'll see the aura that goes around the whole body. But if you look at the sages in the Western traditions, the aura is just around the head. with the idea that love for God, is the way it was explained to me, has been completely intellectualized. And so there has been this rift between this the the material, the dirty material stuff, and the pureness of thought, uh, that was considered literally divine, right? This is one of the reasons geometry was considered such a high thing, because it's all images, and all these relationships are between these images that none of them rely on any material thing. And so the books of Euclid, the derivations of the five basic solids, all those are like an exercise in pure thought. uh, there's some interesting things the way that pure thought later translates to nodes and antinodes of shells of vibrations of, anyway. Little digression. But so there was this separation between the body and the mind, if you will, or material things and the things of higher thought.
As I'm thinking about it, this might be silly to interject, but I'm also wondering if that's just a natural byproduct of forming an ego, way before rationalism. That as soon as there's self-talk, there's a separation between body and mind.
Yeah, it could be. It could be. And, well, and then you get all these other developmental theories like the bicameral mind that we talked about before, and what was consciousness like for the ancients. And we do tend to assume that there hasn't been any evolution of consciousness. That is to say, that we think the same way that the ancients thought. And there have been some psychologists that have challenged that a little bit.
I would definitely assume that the way we think is very different.
Well, I don't just mean the content of thought, I mean the actual mechanism of the hardware.
Oh, okay.
As if, the bicameral mind says that we had a whole sphere that spoke to us as if it was not within our own heads, as if it was the voice of the gods, and that we've somehow developed more interhemispherical data exchange than maybe the ancients did. But maybe they just use that other half of the brain differently. We don't, there's a lot of speculation. And that's one of the things that I would sort of slam Dewey for here. And he's, not different than his time. And that is thinking that the archaic relationship with the metaphysical and the physical was necessarily primitive in all respects.
Hmm.
And this is, of course, is a whole alley we could bark down, but for the purpose of the conversation of martial arts, is martial arts come to represent a sort of a way to reconnect these two different elements of things, so that because martial arts are extremely dependent on consciousness, and yet they're also extremely dependent on presence in physicality. And uh, so so they really do become a sort of a whole organismic undertaking. Within the Buddhist traditions, of course, there's this idea of a do, and the do is like a practice field, an area that you can drop the microscope down on certain capacities for the purpose of refining them and honing them, and then you have them to be applied more at large. And so those are the idea of a dough, literally a path that brings us to, you see it within this metaphorical context, and then you get it to apply everywhere in the big context, microcosm, macrocosm idea. So, the other thing to be said about martial arts, honestly, is that, I mean, across the valley here from us is Los Alamos, which is a state of the art science facility that also is famous for the role that it played in warfare. And if we look through history, we often see that the the cutting edge of technology, like the question that's immediately asked is how can we apply this to war? And that's not a new thing. And presumably, it goes I heard the theory that it goes all the way back to fearing the Neanderthals out there in the dark, and that we have this fundamental, fear for security. And but anyway, that certainly is a form of history. And back in the day of when traditional martial arts were formed, there were weapons, but this human being was still the fundamental weapon. And so martial arts became a uh, uh, the perfect field to manifest the ability to transcend through higher consciousness. Let's put it like that. And I think I
So,
mentioned, yeah, go ahead.
well, maybe you were about to go here, but when you talk about martial arts representing a reunification of kind of the material and the conscious, or the material and the spiritual, or mental.
Mhm.
It made me think about the dichotomy of internal and external martial arts, and how it's possible for one to exist without the other. And I know that you practice both.
Yeah, there's a whole thing about internal, external. That's actually a much, much later uh, distinction. Um, I think that the fundamental practice, uh, before we get to internal and external, it has an effect of putting you in your body. I know that's a cliche way to say that, but the some of the early things that we would teach people, my teachers would say, "Well, we teach you this so you know what's straight." So that you can align your body. I worked for a number of my earlier years teaching kids with developmental disabilities. And so I was kind of able to see the stages by seeing the situation when some of those stages were not successfully completed, but still built on. We talked about that also, I think, in the beginning of the interdependence episode. Um, we can sort of martial arts become a way to sort of recapitulate our development and push it to a new level. Uh, we tend to think only in terms of functional and dysfunctional, but with martial arts, we want to get into that super functional realm. We're not just talking about fixing things that are broken. We're talking about trying to get optimal harmonization between consciousness, for example, and the body, or the different functions within the body. And so, the martial encounter becomes the the model to drop the microscope down on to understand ourselves generically in dealing with challenges. It is 3D, but there's a lot of 4D going on in that. Um, we say, and I think I mentioned before, we have a saying that soft students have to be hardened and hard students have to be softened.
When you say 3D and 4D, I assume what you mean is 3D being in physical reality, and 4D is introducing the mental element.
Right. And there's probably, I probably should add a dimension in there because we've got time and space, which becomes a very important part of the mixture.
Okay.
So that's really kind of a four-dimensional thing, but adding the dimensions of mind and, for example, one's propensity to hardness or propensity to softness, we're not talking about the actual texture physically of the body, although there are differences there too. But we're talking about an energetic or a mental component. And so the personal combat situation comes to be a chessboard, uh, where all these different dimensions, right? You have to have a certain emotional stability. If you're real smart, but you don't have an emotional stability, then smart won't help you and being physical won't help you. If you're very physical and you have a certain emotional control, but you're not very intelligent, then that's not really going to help you either. You're going to get tricked right away. And and to some defense, even though the promise of martial arts is that you can be diminished in physicality, but make up for in energy and the mentality what you're lacking in physicality, and that is true in a rudimentary way. People tend to overestimate the ways and the places where that applies, I think, but so there's something about getting all these things to function harmoniously together and then put it in an environment where, as I've mentioned in past episodes, I have this concept of the Buddha path. And and this is where that comes from, is that no matter what my opponent shows me or how they move or what weapons they have to bring to bear on my target, there's some best path for me to respond with. And I kind of hold that as sort of like the path that I'm looking for. And if I'm in the right condition mentally, I will flow into that place, into that path. But if I'm not, if there's an attachment or there's an aversion or there's a bewilderment, right? Then then I'm going to stick or I'm going to miss the opportunity. And and there are things that are definitely like that. For example, if someone one of the things that I like to do is when you get in a fighting situation, and this shows how we apply yin and yang. Typically, there's going to be an opponent that's more yang and an opponent that's more yin. If I'm facing an opponent where I um, they want to run away and I'm going to have to do a lot of work to catch them, I'm going to have to do something yin to try to get them to come in. I'm going to have to bait them somehow, maybe. And so what I may do is and you can do this with a very aggressive opponent also, is I may act very quick to run away. At the slightest thing that they do, I want them to run away. I want to run away. So I want them to think I'm a big scaredy cat. And so what I want them to do is I want them to shoot for me. Like, you know how when you're hunting ducks, you can't point at the duck, you have to point ahead of the duck. And then in the time that your duck shot travels, the bird travels and they meet each other at this point in space. Well, I want him to start shooting at an imaginary target where he thinks I'm going to be, because that's where I've been running away to every time he threatened to shoot. And then when I read in his eyes that this is the time he's really going to launch and he really goes all in on shooting over my back, that's the time I step right in. And then the weapons that he's developed are not dangerous up close. It's like a hand grenade. If you're standing next to the guy, you can't use a hand grenade on him. You need a certain safe distance, right? Same thing. If I get him to shoot way far, I can run in and catch him mid-step before anything's developed, before any sharp weapons are to be worried about, and I just can throw him on the ground, do whatever I want to do. This sounds maybe like uh, hyper idealistic, but I've done this to fifth on black belts, and it's definitely a doable thing. But so so there's this mix of, it isn't just how fast you move and how strong you move, but there's a psychology behind it. There's understanding the psychology of your opponent. There's understanding what they might want, what they might, that there's this idea of thinking for the opponent, right? Which is basically, what would I do if I was him? Well, if I saw X, I might think Y. So I'm going to show him that. And this is, Sun Tzu's all over this, right? When you're strong, appear weak. When you're close, appear far.
It also reminds me of a practice we do in some strategic planning situations where we try to design the company that would destroy us,
Mhm.
so that we can understand better and more and share understanding.
Mhm.
about where the weaknesses are, and whether we want to guard against it or not is a separate thing, but
Right.
at least understanding.
When you were a kid, did you ever play chess with yourself?
Yeah, and it was actually really hard for me not to end up favoring one side or the other. It was really hard, or it was just getting going nowhere.
Right. Bobby Fischer used to do that, and he said that try as hard as he could, somehow he always won.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love that. Uh, but yeah, that's the idea, and then there's a bunch of different things that you can do, but the idea is still you're not really like you don't just say, "Okay, I'm gonna do that strategy and I'm gonna make him shoot real far and then I'm gonna jump in." That's we call that setting the mind. And setting the mind doesn't work because you're in a flowing circumstance. That's just one of the things. What you come to notice, and this is that pattern recognition over long periods of time, is that certain energies, certain people, certain psychologies just lend themselves to be dealt with in certain ways. And they picked it. You didn't pick it. It's like con men say that you can always you pick the greediest person and they're the easiest ones to con, that sort of a thing. This is basically, trying to understand the psychology of your opponent and showing them what they need to see to do what you want them to do, like that. But it turns out that to do all that, you have to have your ducks relatively in a row, and you have to not be easy to have all that stuff played on you. And so there's that arms race of development to um that gets to some pretty extreme and interesting places, to where they say two high level masters shake hands, they right away know who's going to win. And I could see ways in which that's not fanciful, but so yeah, you get this place where you've got a little metaphorical area to learn how all sorts of things. You learn how to confront, the other energy. You also learn how to overcome your own obstacles, your own tendencies to want to give up on things, or to get easily freaked out by certain things, or um and I can remember times when I was young when I said, "Yeah, if I can do this, I can do anything." Where it was really a challenging to keep going back. Uh,
I'm I'm curious what you think about a practice that puts you firmly in your body, like yoga. And I don't know if yoga has ever been related to fighting. I remember seeing a YouTube video forever ago about a yoga master fighting a kung fu master, and that was interesting, but it was also bizarre.
yeah,
Um,
it depends on what kind of yoga you're talking about.
do you want to say more about that?
Well, within East Indian yoga, there's 5 different types of yoga. The most common that we see here is hatha yoga, and um, they're different practices for sure. They're overlapping because they both use energy and they both use the body. And the I mean, I don't know yoga well enough to say that there aren't similar challenges, but I know that because of the role that physical conflict has probably played in primate psychology, uh, martial arts, and particularly, I don't mean martial arts where you're just kind of doing forms or when everything's very cooperative. I mean when you're actually dealing with the potential of being, dealing with somebody who's doing stuff that's potentially could damage your body, right? And you don't start there. You develop before you can get to that point, right? But I mean martial arts at the level where you can comfortably throw people out of bars, basically. And so it might be unique in that respect. There are definitely things. That's where we start to get into the internal external conversation, and there's a lot of different aspects to that. Um, the quick version is they say that well, I suppose if we go all the way back, we go back to a Chinese doctor named Hua To, and he created what they called the five animal frolics. And these were basic qigongs that imitated certain animals to move energy in certain ways. And
You mentioned energy a couple of times, and I was gonna ask you just before you started talking about the beginning of internal, because I think this is gonna come up. You said about yoga and, martial arts, they both use energy,
right,
but I don't know if our listeners will understand what energy means in that context the
right,
way you said it. So
yeah,
maybe that's where you're going, but let's make
we
sure
can
we
go,
add that in.
yeah, we should get that out of the way. Um, there, this gets into this idea of chi, and there are many settings now where if you say chi, the fur will fly one way or the other. Some people have very strong feelings that there's no such thing. Other people have very fanciful ideas of what chi is. My approach is, the chi, the idea of chi first shows up, as far as I recall, in the Huangdi Neijing, which is the seminal work of the Yellow Emperor's internal classic, the seminal work of Chinese medicine. And I believe that that's where we also see yin and yang applied to the body and five elements theory, I believe. Uh, but that's where chi shows up. And, the character for chi is a fire with a kettle of rice on it and the vapor escaping off of the top of the kettle of rice. And so for me, it's never been, does this thing exist or not? To me, that seems like putting several carts before the horse. This is coming from an ancient text that most Chinese medicine is based on. So for me, the question is, how do I understand what these ancients meant when they said this? They meant something. This isn't just chicken scratching. They weren't delusional because all sorts of things have come out of it as a foundation. So if there's something about it that if I come to the conclusion that it's all just spurious, the fault's on me, not on the yellow emperor. So uh but you'd be surprised the hubris of modern man. They had yellow emperors, yellow cloud. They didn't know what they were talking about. They were all just trying. Well, they meant something about it. And so you got to kind of take some things, take them with the benefit of the doubt, that, or give them the benefit of the doubt that there's some reason they're doing this and that you'll take that as a premise for the purpose of understanding what they're doing, and then I've had enough personal experience with Chinese medicine to know that the doctors that were skilled in it could do things that Western allopathic medicine could not do and had had some shots at and couldn't do it. So, we talked about multi models, right? And the different models have different virtues. And this is a great example of that. There are certain philosophical assumptions made by allopathic medicine that are different than the premise assumptions made by Chinese medicine, traditional Chinese medicine. And so those different models yield different virtues. And it's not a question of best. It's like that's like asking a painter what's the best color. It's like, well, you know, it's up to you. Right? So, but most painters, kind of like them all, or they realize there's a place for them all, even though some of them tend to overuse some more than others. Um, but so there's this idea of chi or energy and an old set of practices like these five animal frolics, and some Taoist practices that they used to call Daoyin, which is like the leading, this idea of leading energy. And then in the yogic traditions, they have this idea of prana, and Kundalini yoga, has a lot of breath methods to move prana. And there's from a Western viewpoint, what I would say, and what I was taught was that for our practical purposes, chi is associated with circulation. Where there's more circulation, there's more chi. That's where chi is moving. And uh, it it sounds strange, but there's a demonstration I'll do at some points, uh, where there's an old classic that says that in understanding the body, uh, we understand that fingernails, for example, are where tendon shows up on the outside, and tongue is where muscle shows up on the outside. Teeth are where bone shows up on the outside. The eyeball is where organs show up on the outside. And hair is where the chi shows up on the outside. And they're not talking about like they wouldn't look at me and go, "Oh, he's got a lot of chi." That's not what that's not what they mean. But what they mean is when you go out in the cold and you get hit by the cold, your body does what Chinese medicine would call um, sends wei qi, which is a defensive kind of qi to the surface. And when that wei qi gets driven to the surface, you get what we typically call goosebumps. And what you see with goosebumps is that every hair is actually standing up. Well, that's because the chi is there, or you get scared at a movie and you might get goosebumps, right? Well, if you get relatively good with doing some basic qigong stuff, which I demonstrate now is maybe not a good time because it's wintertime. Say, oh well, of course he's going to be, have goosebumps, but you can use either breath and push the chi out and make your hair stand up, or if you have more practice of a subtler kind, that would be the Shaolin way, the Buddhist way, would be to push with breath. And that's like Kundalini. They're definitely doing specific breathings to push energy. But the internal art way within the Chinese martial arts, they say, is to lead the chi. And you lead it with mind. You don't push it with breath. And so it's a little trickier and it takes a little longer to do. And but you don't have the dangers that you have if you push with the breath. And that's what I've been told.
And then there's like a system of that breaks chi down into some categories, right? I'm thinking of Jing and Shen. Maybe Shen is leading.
Um, well, um, there's a bunch of different metaphors that they use for that. Uh, the the traditional reference to those they call the three treasures, and the three treasures are Jing, Qi, and Shen. And those also come up in Chinese medicine, but they're used a little differently. In Chinese medicine, the character for Jing it's pronounced Jing, but it's written differently. And it means essence. And so and by essence, this is the grossest material of level of the three. So they might be talking about like eggs and sperm or some actual essence, like the idea that a woman when a girl is born, she has all the eggs that she'll ovulate in her lifetime. That's maybe part of that pre-birth essence that she inherits from her mother.
Or
And so
like
they
your kidney Jing is maybe you can enhance it during your life, but my understanding is you're kind of born with it, and it's going
and
to
you
carry you
support
as
it.
far as it's going to carry you.
And you can support it and protect it, but it's very
Mhm.
hard to make a deposit in that bank account. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's a different kind of Jing. In martial arts, the Jing we're talking about is a particular way for the body to deliver a material force. And then the Qi is different or is the same Qi. And then Shen means spirit. And they are the same within medicine and martial arts, although they're dealt with a little differently. We understand in Chinese medicine that Shen can affect Qi and Jing, and Jing can affect Qi and Shen. And there's a bunch of wonderful statements. They call them in Chinese medicine statements of fact. And they outline all the different interrelationships of these and the organs and the different qualities of the what the organs do, for example. Um, but basically, there is this idea within Taoist alchemy that you can transmute Jing, and in that case, they mean essence, I believe, in like the medical sense. You can transmute Jing into Qi, and then you can transmute Qi into Shen. And what they're talking about basically is internal alchemy. And a way to think about that is that you do a certain physical practice on the Jing level, and that activates and is enhanced by your perhaps with your breathing or perhaps with your intent to start chi to move in a certain way. And then when chi moves in the right way, there can be quite an effect on the Shen level. And that what they're after is what the yogic traditions would say the rising of the Kundalini, the energy that rises up the central channel to open the third eye. So that's the point of Taoist alchemy. Now, within that, uh, that basic up and down energy cycle also is the energy that our five organ systems run off of. And actually a sixth system that's not an organ system, but it's an energetic system. So that's where we get the 12 basic meridians. And those also have the five elements that apply to them. So they're energetic ways of driving that basic orbit or energy circulation to fill certain structures. They will affect the organs associated with that structure, and they also fill a shape, right? And that shape is associated maybe with a movement. So the movement associated uh, with metal, which is associated with lung and large intestine. The movement is up and down, or we call splitting, like splitting with an axe. So it fills the lung and then closes the lung. And all the practices that do that really affect lung energy. So that's kind of how the internal yoga starts to move inside of these physical movements. Uh, Now you can get all that happening, and that won't necessarily help you in a fight. But
Yeah, so
if
maybe that's
but
a
if
good
you
segue to the internal external.
Right. So those are kind of the internal. In the old way, they would say neijia and waijia, and nei is the same nei as in the Huangdi Nei Jing. The in that case, Jing means classic, right? Inside. And some people think, well, that inside refers to the inside of your body, but other people say that that is neijia. Jia means family, and so what they're saying is inner family and outer family, or basically the stuff that we keep inside and the stuff that we let out. And they'll say, well, the Waija, that's the stuff that's outside for outer family, and this stuff with all the juicy internal yoga, that's all held inner family. And but so these are just different interpretations of these Chinese terms. But I believe it was not that long ago, Sun Lutang. So we're talking Civil War or later than the Civil War, uh, when he coined that phrase between internal and external.
Chinese Civil War?
No, American Civil War.
Oh, okay. Good. I thought I didn't know which Chinese Civil War you might be referring to, but we're
Right,
talking
exactly.
1860s.
Right. Yep. Yep.
Got it.
And he might have been into the 1880s. I'd have to check on that. But he, within the golden age of Chinese martial arts, what's interesting about the internal external thing is that it's very common for famous masters to have started with some external practice. And then they converted over at some point into an internal practice. And then they became prodigious masters, often winning a lot of contests. Uh, Rarely, I can't think of a case where I've seen it go the other way or where you hear about it, where somebody started out with an internal art and then they kind of went off into the way I was taught in the Bhagwat Song lineage. They said that you come to Bagua to come to completion. And so it was already sort of assumed that I knew all sorts of things and that I already had a bunch of training, like how to get punched in the nose and not quit. That's an important part of training, right? And so that's the idea of being, within those traditions, there are inner door students and outer door students. And the inner door students get information that the outer door students typically don't. And to make that transition is usually costly, financially, and you have to kind of be introduced by an inner door student, and then you have to kind of prove yourself by maybe being an outer door student for a number of years before you're actually accepted as an inner door student.
So just for clarification, well, I'll just throw this out there. I'm sure it's not accurate enough. So, but maybe it gets you started. External martial arts are about fighting, and internal martial arts are about generating Shen, Jing, and Qi.
Um, well, if they're just about generating Jing, Qing, and Qi, they're not martial arts.
Say more.
Yeah. So, well, there are a lot of people that you can do the form and you can get the benefits, and you've kind of are getting some of the benefits of the yoga components, but you're not. That's not a martial art. Like, and you don't have anything that's going to work in a martial aspect. Maybe
But
you can
it's still
maybe you'll
Tai
stay
Chi.
centered while they smack you or something. But
But that's interesting because it's still called Tai Chi, right? And that's still considered an internal martial art, or not. It's just an internal
well,
something
the
else.
full name is Tai Chi Chuan. And Chuan means literally to roll up the fingers and therefore fist and therefore boxing. So and there are people that say, "Well, I don't teach boxing, but I still want to teach this form. So I'm just going to call it Tai Chi. I'm not going to call it Tai Chi Chuan since I lost the Chuan." In a strict sense, you probably don't know that much of what there is within the art if you don't have all those pieces. Like, if you're just passing on a form, you probably shouldn't you probably should be trying to seek deeper instructions so that you can get better.
So how do
Uh,
you characterize internal and external martial arts? Because obviously I did a very
um, right.
superficial job of that.
Well, there's different ways. Um, some will say, well, if it originated out of Shaolin, then it's Waijia, then it's external. And if it's originated out of Wudang, which is a different temple up in the north, then it's considered internal boxing. And but I'm not sure that that's what Sun Lutong was thinking when he came up with that. And, uh, in Sun Lutong's time, uh, I think that boxers in China went through different chapters. And back in the day, there was a point when these martial arts were really kind of in their heyday, where you were safe in the cities for the most part. But the problem came when you tried to go from one city to another city, and you had to be traveling on the road, and particularly if you had valuables. You want to go someplace, you want to buy a bunch of cows or something. Well, you now got to carry something carryable and hence carry offable that's of the value of all of it. So there was a business it was a popular industry rather to run caravans. And if you were going from X to Y, you would join this caravan. So you'd all go together and you'd pay somebody who had the skills to take on the bandits. And if possible, his reputation is big and bad enough that he can just put a banner in the front of the caravan that says his name. And all the smart bandits will see that and they'll just decide to chill till the next caravan comes along. So there's a whole business in there, and some of the famous shingy masters were involved in that business, and also bounty hunting. Because once you had a criminal, they're out there in the hills. It wasn't like today where they had the resources and the technology to just grab somebody. So bounty hunting was a much more of a thing. And so you had guys that were, I guess my point is that these people were ready to throw down. Like that was their bread and butter. And so they had a reputation of being kind of lowbrows because they're, head butters and nose biters. And so they end up, uh, well, I think what Sun Lutong was trying to do was he was trying to elevate the reputation a little bit by associating it more with a scholarly type of pursuit and to sort of rehab the image of martial arts during those years. And so he was the one that started to try to put some of the philosophical underpinnings and do some writings about it. And because remember, for most of this time, not anybody could just sit down and write a book. Learning, knowing how to write meant you were a scholar who had specifically been trained in writing. In fact, one of the Yang family masters tried to write a book, and it was so poorly done that some of his top students quickly bought all the copies so that they could take it out of circulation so they wouldn't be embarrassed by it. And then some of his students who were lettered, men of letters, they actually, in collaboration with him, I think, wrote some things that were more to the standard. But so there was kind of this rehabilitation of the reputation, and because fighting has been a necessary thing to not have people just punk on you, but it's definitely got some difficult elements, some coarse aspects to it. And when I was young, I was a kid that had moved from Ohio, from the Midwest to New York, and I was not ready for the intensity uh, of being punked on like the possibility was there. And so that's what got me to martial arts was I thought it was brains over brawn, and then I learned that actually you're going to need to have some brawn involved yourself. And then, like I was saying, there was this distinction between things of the mind and things of the body, and I was sort of a victim to that. I did well in school, and so, kids that wore glasses were not kids that they expected to be the quarterbacks of the football team. There was the idea that you're either physical or you were mental, and that mental was higher anyway, so you should try to push people in that direction. And this idea that the brain needed the body to be functioning optimally for the brain to be functioning optimally, that was like mind blowing, right? Uh, so basically, I feel like I was kind of bamboozled out of my physical capacities by poor education and by educational myths that were wrong. And so it was kind of like a little aha that if I worked hard and I trained and I did what I needed to do, I could actually do pretty good with it. And then being smart was just an added thing on top, you know. And then Cho came in and he said, "You never be a good fighter if you're not smart." But that didn't mean that you couldn't work hard. You didn't have to work hard. You still need part of being smart is being able to make yourself work hard. It's not just knowing things, right? It's being able to eat bitter, is what we say, right? Being able to do things that are uncomfortable to you. And
Did we get a distinction in that between internal and external? Because I wasn't able to grab one there.
okay, well, like I say, one is if it's from Shaolin or it's from Wudang.
Right? But
And then the
when I
other
think
one
of,
was
yeah,
Sun
go ahead.
Lutong, yeah, who made this distinction between inner family and outer family. And uh, he grouped these certain martial arts, Tai Chi, Xingyi, Bagua. I think Liu Bafa was around. There's other martial arts that really are considered internal, different cotton fists, and and then of those styles that I named, there's many different branches. Um, within within modern martial arts, we I guess we haven't had the conversation, but there's a parallel in religions. Um, in America, martial arts tend to be organizational. Like we are this organization, we all have this patch, we have this many schools in our organization, and we all do the same forms, and we all follow the same structure, and it all came from this same teacher. And within, I mean, there's some of that, but I think within China or within these traditions, when people became masters, they had sort of distinguished themselves from their own masters. And so their styles were a little bit different. They had maybe incorporated some things, they had maybe really liked some things and maybe didn't do much of other things that the last generation did do. So really, each generation is kind of a little different unless the person that received it never got to the level of actually being a master. Then they might just always be just a student. Uh, but by the time they're kind of recognized as a lineage holder within their own right, they might distinguish themselves as quite different from other lineage holders in the same tradition. So, for example, within the Bagua tradition, I think there's 13 original disciples that Dong Hai Chuan had. And then every branch, everybody who's practicing Bagua today, we're probably now in the fifth and sixth, and maybe even to the seventh generations. They should know all their branches all the way back to Dong Hai Chuan. And so it's like a tree, and you're at, right? And then there's like Hsing Chuan, a number of the Hsing masters were also Bagua masters. So in some places, the Hsing tree and the Bagua tree kind of tangled together in the same hedge. And so, but each one of these teachers had their own way of doing things and their own strengths and their own weaknesses and their own things that they brought in. And part of understanding the lineage teaching is understanding each one of those generations and what those masters brought into your lineage, which is very personal, right? As opposed to we all do this because we all do the same stuff and we all, there's a lot more personal expression in this approach, less franchise business.
So when a master starts with an external form and external school, and then gravitates towards an internal art, and then becomes very successful, what is that master getting from chapter 2 there that wasn't available in chapter 1?
How did you mean? What did when he came to completion?
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, let's say you started with Taekwondo, and then later you did a bunch of Xingyi and Tai Chi and Bagua. What did you get from those that you didn't get from Taekwondo?
um, well, that's a good way to put it. Um, the Taekwondo forms that I learned first were derivative from Shotokan forms, which were gotten by Gishin Funakoshi from Okinawa. I believe the Shori branch of Okinawa Te. The Okinawan people got it from Fujian White Crane originally. And you can see the translation of some of the movements and the way the White Crane, and so so what happened with me was I was in this organization and they were doing these forms. I ended up changing schools and we did a different set of forms, but they were also sort of derivative. And so Gishin Funakoshi was the founder of Shotokan Karate in 1922, I believe. And so this would have been in the 60s, early 70s. Funakoshi had passed, of course, but his successor, whose name is Shigeru Agami, he had written a book called the Heart of Karate Do, and he was the titular head of Shotokan at the time, and he would publish these regular bulletins called Changes in Technique, and they were all sort of collected into this. And he said all these wonderful things in there. I just love, like he said, we used to think that all strikes happened in straight lines, but now we realize that no strikes happen in straight lines. And he said, we used to practice to make our bodies strong, but then we found out that what we were doing was only making us muscle bound. And and so that's why he's honing and refining these techniques. Well, there are a lot of things that happen in those old forms that are kind of mysterious movements. And why would you do them if you're just trying to understand them like you're seeing a martial art for for combat? So for example, some of those will come with a real heavy breathing. I know that and a movement like if you're watching us on Rumble or YouTube, you can see this, but it might have a sound to it with a breath like as they do these various movements. And Shigeru Agami talked in this book about not really knowing what was going on with those and going to China to talk to the Tai Chi masters to see what he could learn about it. And so now these lineages, see, and the reason that I'm hesitant to say what's internal and what's external is because there really isn't a super hard line. Although, I mean, like, yeah, hard style karate is clearly what we call external, but it has internal practices in it. And you might see something like Chuan or something that just looks like really, really soft and formless, but it actually came from a guy who was quite a prodigious fighter. Whether they've been able to continue that is a different question, but it goes on with every lineage. Um, so, the the external practitioners, they do have internal practices, but their understanding is kind of like developed from the outside in. And maybe some very high level external masters do attain a place of softness. Some of them do come and actually learn Tai Chi or internal arts. Um, so with the internal artists, it isn't that we're just generating these things, Jing and Jing, Qi, and Shen, but we're trying to get them to link. And this idea of what exactly goes on when Jing, Qi, and Shen link, that's where you get into all these old metaphors. So, for example, they'll say that Shen is the general and the Jing, the final movement energy that hits the opponent, that's the troops. But the Qi is the like the banner that the general would use to tell the troops to attack or to roll left or to go right or to retreat. So the thing that activates the troops is the Qi. So what we're trying to do is change the relationship because ordinarily mind just moves the muscles, and there is this different thing about how mind moves energy, energy moves muscles, or they all kind of come along together. And the way that's just where there's some funny things about ways I've had this described to me by various Chinese teachers. You probably know where I'm going with this, right? So let's see if I can say this in a way that doesn't get us a strike. Um, there are certain parts of the male anatomy that will only move with energy, and no amount of will make that piece of anatomy move without energy being there. And I said before, we connect chi movement with circulation. So now there's a great industry selling pharmaceuticals that can help that circulation kick in to make that effect, right? So the funny story is that one master from China who's teaching here in the United States, he basically announced to a whole class of I don't know 40 or 50 people. He said, "My whole well, now okay, there's another piece of the metaphor that gets connected here. We say that when we issue energy or we throw energy off, one of the classics says that it's like a dog shakes water off of his back, right? It's got a snapping to it, right? And so he somehow is describing this, and then he's describing this part of male anatomy that only moves when energy's there. And so he ends up, you'll have to assemble this on your own at home, but he ends up announcing to the whole group, my whole body is like big dog, part of male anatomy. And I told him I'm going to quote you on that. But what he's trying to say is that he's not, and there is something that does happen here when this linking up happens. Okay. So if you can imagine the general not having the flag and him having to ride his horse to every different commander to tell him, okay, it's time to charge, it's time to retreat, it's time. Well, that would be horribly inefficient, right? It would be slow, if nothing else, right? So what you do find, what I found was after I had practiced these, and I didn't start practicing internal until like, I don't know, my mid 30s. So you're definitely not as fast in your mid 30s as you were when you're 22 and you're training speed. But what I found was that I might have something in my hands and it might slip out of my fingers. And I found that I could catch it before it hit the ground. And it was as if I had increased my nervous system speed somehow. Like there was less antagonistic resistance, but I don't think it's just because I was much looser, because I had been practicing arts that were not trying to make me tense, but were actually wanting the structure to be loose around cotton wrapped around the steel, right? And so, but I think there was more going on there. I think that there was a linkage that went on, and there is something that happens if you practice the right things and you do it long enough to where you will feel that energy is moving and that energy is connected with circulation. And so, for example, you can practice outside when it's cold and you won't get cold. And then you stop and boom, it's in on you in a second, right? And I've done this in Alaska in the wintertime, right? Steam rolling off you. Um, I might have mentioned there's I went out when I was first practicing and when I was first learning some internal stuff, and I was holding a posture. This is another thing that shows up. If you go and say you want to do a posture with your hands held out, your arms are going to get really, really heavy before too long. And you'll find that if you connect this chi structure, you will be able to hold your arms out there much longer. Like there is definitely a strength that happens there, but this doesn't happen overnight. Like you have to really do the practices to do this. And I think that from what I witness now commonplace in America, most people aren't doing the right stuff the right way long enough to really get that happening. So they tend to fool themselves and they tend to say, "Oh, well, I can feel this tingling," and that no, this is still not you're not in the gate yet. Most people don't want to eat bitter enough to really get it, but it should be. It's unmistakable when it happens, right? I mean, I was when I first started practicing, this is what I was gonna say before, I was doing the structure with my arms up, and I was holding my hands in a random way. I wasn't consciously channeling them energy through all 5 fingers. I was basically extending through my 3 pinky to middle finger and kinda just leaving off the index and thumb. Not for any reason, just because I was indiscriminate in how I was holding this structure up for some reason. And it's wintertime, and I'm walking around the circle for a while doing that. And then I noticed the strangest thing that those 3 fingers are warm, and thumb and index fingers are frozen. And it was so weird. I went inside, and Annie was inside, and I said, "Feel this." And I stuck my hand up on her face. I said, "Is that real or is this a body hallucination?" And I was like, "No, those 3 fingers are warm and these 2 aren't." And I think I was studying with Bruce Francis at the time, and I was like, "Dude, what's up with that?" And he said, "Well, what were you doing?" And I showed him. He says, "Well, you're only directing chi through through those 3 fingers. You got to extend chi through all their. well, what is extending chi? What is all this stuff that you have to so understanding it intellectually doesn't put it in your body. You have to learn it in your body. And now people have a lot of vague ideas and they don't always have the right practices. And so we're slowly getting smarter about these things, but there's a lot of people just passing on forms and they don't understand the insides. And so
And
that
there are a
limits
lot of
everything.
charlatans too,
Yeah.
saying things like they can affect you with their energy when they're doing qigong, or like they like, can you feel this kind of stuff? I've seen demonstrations of that, and people will hypnotize themselves into feeling it. Um,
I can't say who's hypnotizing what. I remember somebody who did go to China who had a serious handicap, and they seemed to think that parts of their body were getting warmer based on things that this qigong master was doing. But I bet you could do that with hypnosis if you did it right, you know. So and again, uh, what are we trying to do? If as long as we're not fooling ourselves, as long as we're achieving the end, then I'm not particular about the means.
yeah,
But if we're talking about healing something, if you can hypnotize somebody into healing, I'm all for it. But we don't want to take any wooden nickels either. So
yeah. So maybe there's a way to bring this back to what is the value of this knowledge and this practice today,
yeah,
relative to where we are in the world, who we are in the world. Why does this matter?
yeah. Well, it depends on which chapter you're in, what relevance it has for you. Um, I've
When you say
taught
which
kids.
chapter you're in, you're talking about individual development.
Right, right. So I've taught kids from, if they're too young, it's no use to bother them. Let them follow their natural agenda, developmental agenda. I have worked with kids where there were problems where we needed to kind of drop the focus on and help facilitate some stages. But those problems they were not normal. Those were uh, some were pathologies and some were complications from a complicated birth and seizures and other things going on. So, um, but but so to me, I think the most significant aspect of it is the holistic aspect of it, and I don't mean that in a buzzword sense. I mean, for example, within Bhagavad Song, the Buddhist model for meditation says, there's a monkey and there's an elephant. The elephant is yin, the monkey is yang. Monkey wants to monkey with everything. The elephant's very lethargic. So if you're falling asleep when you meditate, that's the elephant needs a prod. If your mind is just won't settle down, then you got to put a leash on the monkey, and then you just kind of fight it out with these animals. And so the Taoist approach was more like consciousness rests on the energy of the five basic organ systems. So if you do the internal practices that balance out those organ systems, then a state of meditation will arise. And then the animals don't need to be coerced. And so there's a naturalness to
I
that
would
and
say
not
the animals
employment of means.
the animals do still need to be coerced, but it's happening at a different point in the process, because you're not going to eat bitter without coercing the animals.
Yeah, and you don't get into a loop of self reprobation because the monkey keeps escaping the leash or your prod isn't waking the elephant up successfully. It could be that there's a reason why that's physiological that we could supply, because there really isn't the the body really is the vehicle. Some traditions call it the temple, but it's more of a they use temple, but they didn't have a radio metaphors in those days because if you think about like we talked about the Hunyuan Qi, the thing that the elements of nature that sew everything together, that the partness of all those holons, right? That energy of all their partnesses connected, that our nervous system is like an 8-channel receiver set for those energies. That's part of part of what this idea of kundalini moving through different centers is, that energy is qualified at these different stages, and it shows up as different things at different levels, right? So the idea is that this is this vessel, this receiver. We kind of want it operating in its optimal form so that we get the purest transmissions, and so that our consciousness, our awareness, can rest on the most solid foundation. So we're not going to be blown by those winds, right? And so that the center holds, to use the I Ching's model. But that sort of implies a kind of a radial balance, that five elements sort of mirror. So this is just Epictetus again telling us to come to terms with our ass, for it bears us. But the idea is that there's dimensions in which it can bear us,
It's a much more precise
and
statement.
the better we come to terms with it, the cooler places it may bear us
Mhm.
to really push the the livestock metaphor here. um, but that's and that's what I mean by an embodiment. I don't mean it in a loose metaphorical way. I mean it that these practices, by we talked about the connection in the brain and the different functions of the brain, and that movement works with the brain in a certain way, and music works with the brain in a certain way, and that there is a holism there. And that's the holism that I'm trying to optimize when I have an opponent charging at me, or I've got to deal with a raging drunk, in a bar. It's one practice to say, okay, I'm in the Zendo. I have the nice sandalwood smell. It's very quiet. I'm very peaceful. And now I can attain this nice state of balance and everything. But it's a whole other thing to not lose your balance when the bull is charging at you. And that's, if you have it there, you have it everywhere, right? So that's kind of that idea of that path of move, stillness in movement. That's that saying that the stillness in stillness is not the true stillness, but stillness in the movement. And so, how do I keep stillness in my movement? How do I have that point of awareness? And that's why we say in Tai Chi Chuan, we refer to the waist as the mill wheel. And so, one of the master's statements from the classics is, "The mill wheel turns, but the mind does not turn." So, I always love that one too. It's one of the classics.
It's reminiscent of our conversation about shamanism in some respects.
Hmm.
Like uh, metaphorically, being able to maintain one center with a bull charging at them is very much part of shamanic practice. And I didn't get to that point with martial arts where I got enough sparring or fighting experience to know what that really feels like.
Right.
Um, but I'm curious how parallel it is to being in a really heavy ceremony and having one's shit together.
Yeah. And I mean, and it bears similarities to if you're a good musician and you can improvise, then it has a lot of those same elements involved with a presence to the phenomenon and the immediate reaction and feedback without a lot of opportunity for intellectual processing. Like, yeah, you might know you're coming back to the one chord, but you want to be in the listening more than the thinking forward. And so there's that kind of, that's why I say, when you get to a certain point, there isn't a lot of internal chatter when you're facing a serious opponent. You're just in a state of what? Where there's just openness, complete openness to experience so that I can let it pass through me and into movement and reaction and response in a natural way. And that's why it's like, yeah, people want to do forms and forms and forms and forms, but this is like playing the same song on an instrument over and over and over and over. You might master the song that way, but you won't master the instrument that way. And we really want to master the instrument. And then, those stories, I think we told the story in one episode about the Buddha and Angulimala. And, there's very practical applications. I just saw a wonderful quote by Maya Angelou, and it was about how courage is the most important virtue. Because without courage, you can't practice all the other virtues because you're too vulnerable. You'll get bamboozled or forced or one way or the other, feared out of your virtue. So courage is real important. And courage is an energetic condition. It's not just a mental condition. It actually has physiological and physical components to it. And that is something that you can learn in martial arts for sure. And that's something that happens on a subtle level. You want to know why they don't pick you to be the one to attack that or why they do. That's all on that energetic level. And that's when we talked about when you can go and sit down next to the guy who's the potential troublemaker with a big smile. That's an energetic encounter. It's not a physical encounter fundamentally. And so there's a lot of benefits to that. It adds dimensions to us. And it makes us way less vulnerable psychologically as well as physically. And that's worth a whole lot, I think, nowadays too, especially.
Yeah. Amen.
Yeah, yeah.
Cool.
That
Maybe
would be
let's
a
leave
good
it there
place,
for
huh?
today, and I'm sure we'll come back to this theme probably soon.
Absolutely. Sounds good.
Thanks, Brian.
We'll see you folks next time.